This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Last weekend, politicians, diplomats, and TLDR hosts from across the world gathered in Munich for the annual Munich Security Conference. While most of the speeches were generally critical of Russia and focused on maintaining support for Ukraine in the medium to long term, on Saturday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi bucked the trend, attacking the US for obstructing peace talks and pursuing strategic goals larger than Ukraine itself. Interestingly, Wang also promised that China itself would publish its own peace plan for Ukraine.
On the Ukraine issue, China's position boils down to supporting talks for peace. We will put forth China's position on the political settlement on the Ukraine crisis and stay firm on the side of peace and dialogue.
And China kept to that promise, publishing their plan on Friday, the one-year anniversary of the Russian invasion, after Wang went to Moscow to discuss the conditions of peace with Putin. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at the contents of Wang's headline-grabbing speech, the new Chinese plan for peace in Ukraine, and whether it stands a chance of working. So, let's start by taking a look at Wang's speech and the question and answer section afterwards, because it was pretty interesting. In the Western media, Wang's speech was widely reported as pro-Russian and anti-West. But at least as we see it, that's not quite right. Wang's speech wasn't actually at any point actively pro-Russia. In fact, Wang opened by reiterating that China supported the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, and considered, quote, power politics were damaging global peace.
For a safer world, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries must be respected. Power politics and hegemony are a recipe for global instability and do the biggest damage to global peace.
Nor was Wang's speech actively anti-West. Rather, it was specifically anti-American. For example, towards the end of his speech, Wang appealed to Europe, but notably not the US, when he talked up the possibility of win-win cooperation, one of the CCP's favorite talking points.
Making the world a safer place also hinges on the right choice of both China and Europe. China and Europe are two major forces, markets, and civilizations in an increasingly multipolar world. The choices we make have a huge impact on where the world goes. If we choose dialogue and cooperation, bloc confrontation will not emerge. If we choose peace and stability, a new Cold War will not break out. If we choose openness and win-win, global development and prosperity will have greater hope.
And this was made particularly clear in the Q&A session afterwards. When asked what China was planning to do to uphold its stated commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity, Wang responded with a thinly veiled diatribe against America, where he seemed to accuse the US of not caring about the lives of Ukrainians or the harms imposed on Europe, and instead using the war to pursue its own strategic goals.
Short. Some forces might not want to see peace talks to materialize. They don't care about the life and death of Ukrainians, not the harms on Europe. They might have strategic goals larger than Ukraine itself.
Clearly then, Wang was trying to force a split between Europe and the US by imploring Europe not to mimic the US's hawkish stance on Ukraine. Wang was even more cutting when asked about the balloon incident, describing the US's response as absurd and hysterical. Again, Wang tried to draw a line between the US and Europe, claiming that the US was co-opting Europe into an anti-China stance.
With this perception, the United States is using all of its means to clamp down and smear China, and is co-opting other countries to do the same.
If there was any doubt after all of this that China doesn't like the US at the moment, on Monday, the Chinese Foreign Ministry published a new communique titled US Hegemony and Its Perils, which accused the US of everything from wanton use of physical force, looting and exploitation, and spreading false narratives. Anyway, apart from its anti-American bellicosity, the other notable thing about Wang's speech was that he announced China's plans for peace in Ukraine. And as I mentioned, this is a plan that the Chinese Foreign Ministry published on Friday, which also happened to mark the one-year anniversary of Putin's invasion. Now, the whole thing is on the Foreign Ministry's website, and it's less than 1,000 words long, so we'd recommend that you give it a read if you've got time. Unsurprisingly though, it's not particularly specific. The 12 points in the plan include stuff like ceasing hostilities, keeping nuclear power plants safe, and reducing strategic risk. What's perhaps most interesting about the plan though is that it's not as pro-Russia as you might expect. In the last few days, the US has been warning that China is about to step up its military aid to Russia. And The Sun reported on Friday that China had agreed to send the Russian army hundreds of kamikaze drones, akin to the Iranian-made Shahed drones that proved so effective earlier in the war. Now, if these reports are true, then this would imply that China and Russia are basically military allies. And as such, you'd expect the Chinese plan for peace to be vehemently pro-Russia. However, that's not the case, at least by our reading. The first point in it, which urges both sides to respect the sovereignty of all countries and insists that big and small countries, read Russia and Ukraine, are equal members of the international community, is clearly aimed at Russia. Similarly, the 8th point, which reiterates China's opposition to the use of nuclear weapons, might be read as a riposte to Putin's decision to unilaterally pull out of the START non-proliferation treaty earlier this week. Now, obviously, there's also some anti-US and anti-NATO rhetoric in there as well. For example, the second point implicitly criticizes NATO for expanding its military bloc. And the 10th point reminds the US that sanctions should be done via the UN. But on the whole, it is more balanced than some commentators expected. So, onto the big question, will it actually work? Well, the plan is currently obviously way too vague to be implemented as is. But there are reasons for optimism. For starters, China is perhaps the only country with the political weight to negotiate a ceasefire. So it's good news that they're taking an interest, assuming that they're sincere about it. It's also worth saying that both Russia and Ukraine have responded relatively positively. While the Europeans and the US were quick to dismiss the paper, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, for example, told CNN that the proposal should have ended after the first bullet point. The Ukrainians have been somewhat more muted. And Wang apparently told Ukraine's foreign minister about the key elements of the plan in advance, which bodes well. And on the Russian side, Wang visited Moscow earlier this week, presumably to discuss the plan. And it seems to have gone down well, because after the meeting, Russia's foreign minister said that the two countries showed the readiness to speak in defense of each other's interests. Nonetheless, even if this doesn't work, this is a savvy political move from China. The vast majority of the international community just want this war over, as demonstrated by the UN resolution calling for peace under the terms of the UN Charter. So, while most of the world has been horrified by Russia's blatant aggression, many countries have also been worried about the patterns of escalation we've seen so far. And China's peace plan allows it to represent these anxieties and actually look like a diplomatic powerhouse. Ultimately, though, we all want to be that kind of person who learns something new every day. That's likely why you watch our videos. And that makes sense, because everyday learning keeps us sharp and makes us and the world around us more interesting. But the reality is that daily learning is hard to do, and that's where Brilliant.org comes in. That's because Brilliant.org is the best way to learn vital skills like maths, computer science, and decision-making interactively. And Brilliant has thousands of lessons, from foundational and advanced maths to the latest artificial intelligence, data science, neural networks, and more, with new lessons added monthly and staying on top of the latest developments and trends that you hear about in the news and even in our videos. Plus, the course on the joys of problem solving is a particularly great start for our viewers, running through the fundamental decision-making processes that experts and even politicians make every day. Or at least the good ones do. So take a positive step in your learning and check out everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by clicking the special link in the description. Plus, the first 200 people of you sign up will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support.